Well, welcome. I'm hoping in today's session to try and answer a simple question, which has to do with what men believe that they will get from marriage versus what actually is is available and what they actually get. You've heard me say before that modern men in the West need not consider marriage for a number of reasons. Um, that statement certainly um, is not based on my personal preferences, and it's not based on my value system. It's not based on my experiences per se. It's really based on the reality of the environment that we coexist in presently. Let me leave one or two. I mean, I guess you might call them landing statements before I go into the ideal versus um, the actual. If you have no intentions of being a father, if you do not want to have kids, there is no reason that I can foresee for a man, a modern man, to want to get married. A modern man in the West, the developed West. Now, there are areas out of the developed West where the concept of marriage still exists. The tradition of marriage is still respected. It's not just a contract, a piece of paper. So if you have no intentions of having children, marriage should not be something you should be purposefully pursuing. The second, if you have not achieved your dreams, you should not consider marriage. And particularly, I'm talking about your financial or your economic dreams, a passion, a goal you have, your career, perhaps a pursuit that will give you a sense of meaning and purpose, structure. But the key thing is marriage and fatherhood is a full-time job. And one of the most significant reasons why disputes and debates and arguments and eventually the dissolution of the marriage takes place is on economic grounds. So if you haven't created what I would call a reservoir of available funds, or perhaps you haven't acquired enough assets, you haven't developed your earning potential, you haven't become a master in your field, it's best to delay marriage. Marriage should not be considered for men below 35 for a number of reasons. I've talked about it before. From 30, you can start considering the idea if you want to have kids. From 35, you can make the decision. In any case, three important points. If you don't want to have kids, you shouldn't be considering marriage. If you haven't achieved your goals and dreams, whether you're a male or whether you're a woman, you should not be considering marriage. Your goal, your dream should come first. And finally, if you're below 35, you should ideally not be considering marriage. Now, let me delve in slightly deeper into some of the reasons. And this is where I get to compare the ideal scenario versus the actual scenario. Now, let me present a number of concepts, and I'll let you critique as to whether you believe I'm misguided, or if you believe I'm mistaken. Now, here's an ideal scenario. Now, this is the idea that is fed into the minds of men from a very young age. The idea is, if you get married, what you get in return, the benefit you get in return for marriage, is the woman's youth, her beauty. In many ways, you're getting her body in its purest form, in its most attractive state. It's similar to buying a brand new car. That's number one. Your youth, your beauty. We, in many ways, in the sexual marketplace. We refer to that as your SMV, your sexual marketplace value. Your height, size, in terms of dress size, and all the attributes that your body comes with, cup size, bum size, and the shape you come with. All of that makes up what we call your sexual value. The younger you are, the more attractive you are, because your body still retains its plumpness, its rigidity, its, gravity is not taking a toll on you. For example, I cannot compete with my 30-year-old self on looks. I cannot compete with my 20-year-old self, and I cannot compete with my 18-year-old self because I'm older. In the same way, a woman's value, because men are very, very visual, we tend to judge initially based on your looks. And this is where your youth, your beauty, and your body comes in. The second thing is, in many ways, connected to your body, is if a man wants to have a family, he is expected that he's getting you and your womb. Meaning, ideally, you haven't had kids by or for someone else. Now, I know the whole concept of being a virgin is antiquated. It's old-fashioned, and very few men, modern men, are expecting you to be virgins. But what they do expect is that at least there are no issues surrounding your ability to reproduce if what they're looking for is a family. So the second point is your body and your womb. Again, people would vary in their preferences, but generally we're talking about those two major things. The second part, when I refer to your womb, is something I refer to as your RFV, which is your reproductive fertility value. If we go back to the 1940s, the average age at which a woman got married was about 23 in the United Kingdom. Over the last 150 years, the average age has been roughly about between 22 and 26. In that range, with the average being about 25 over the entire 150-year period. I've done a different video where I explain the concept of your reproductive fertility value, but let me say very, very briefly and very quickly. Between 18 and 35, a woman has, based on biology, has to make certain decisions about her future in that period. Between 18 and 35, that is the period when, if you're looking to reproduce, you are the most fertile. The earlier you are, the more eggs you have, and the more quality of eggs that you have. The longer you wait and the later you wait, the fewer eggs and the fewer quality eggs you have. This is simply biology. This concept is not being taught to young women, which is a shame, because most people are delaying their decisions until they become too late. Traditionally, what men expected was that when they found and they met someone, they would get the woman in an optimal state. So, for example, I break this down into 4 different groups, age groups. The first 5 years, the next 5, the next 5, and the remaining 3. So you have 18 to 22, 23 to 27, 27 to 32, and then you have 33, 34, 35, which are the last 3. Overall, 18 years. What that means is every 5 years, you lose about, roughly based on that 18-year period, you lose about 25% of your reproductive fertility value, just based on the numbers. Now, what that means is that by 25, a woman is still what you might call, on a scale, a 9 or a 10. maybe you're a 10 between 18 and 22, a 9, 10 between 18 and 22, and perhaps between a 7 and an 8, sometimes going up to a 9, between 22 all the way up to 27. So at 25, you're still pretty much around that 8 plus range. In any case, you've heard me say before, delay for women, you should delay starting a family until 28, so that you have enough time to have an attempt at achieving your goals and your dreams and your ambitions before you're saddled down with the concept of a maternal role. At 28, you're still in a peak state in terms of your ability to reproduce. Unfortunately, the longer you wait, again, this is just biology. It has nothing to do with my opinion or some form of double standard. If there is a double standard, that is a double standard that nature has dealt to each and every one of us. So the second item referring to your womb and your body is you have to make the decisions. If you want to have a family, and if the man wants to have a family, he's thinking, I should be able to have a family. Now, the third, as part of the ideal benefits, the men have a false conception that they will get, has to do with what I call your non-sexual marketplace value. And this has to do with what I call the virtues and the attitude and the traditional skill sets you've acquired as part of being a woman. Back in the day, young women were prepared for their roles as wives and mothers. So they were taught how to cook, how to clean, how to nurture, how to serve, how to be inspiring, how to look after a home, how to, in many ways, contain. Women have always played the role of scribes, in many ways recording what happens over time. Unfortunately, that's an ideal scenario. So a man is expecting that in terms of your non-sexual marketplace value, in addition to being somewhat traditional, you would have the feminine traits. And all of those traits would have been taught to you, ideally, by the age of 18, because usually that's when most young girls leave their homes to pursue either the education or their careers or their jobs. So all of that is something that should be instilled in the individual pre-18. That's item number 3. Now, number 4 has to do with a combination of the 3, which means your beauty, your youth, your body, your womb, your traditional values. Now, when you combine those 3 things, what that means is number 4 has to do with that. A lady who is raised in that state, and let me use an example, someone who is a virgin. She's had no sexual experience. She's not been touched by a man. She's been taught how to be a wife. She's been taught how to be a woman. That would mean that she's been taught how to be feminine. That would mean that she has very little baggage because she hasn't been exposed to all of the trauma that comes with being an adult. She's been protected. Probably one of the most attractive reasons why men want wives. That they're getting someone who is not traumatized, does not have a baggage of issues from the past, someone who can easily work with them in the union of marriage, looking forward. Number 5 has to do with debts. Traditionally, it used to be the case that parents paid for the upbringing of their kids, tuition for school, and they lived at home. So most women had almost or very little debt. Daddy paid all the expenses, and you lived at home. So you didn't have a need for accumulating debt. And that was very attractive because in most cases, If you go back in historical context, the dowry was paid by the father of the bride to the husband to be, their family. In other words, it was a token gesture to say, I understand that my daughter will be an expense if she stayed with me, and I have to look after her. So for the sake of showing my appreciation, and although you've come seeking her hand in marriage, here is a token for the troubles or expenses that you might incur. Now, don't get excited by the choice of words. Just stick with the idea that I'm trying to share. But the whole point was that with the man receiving a woman, that he was not getting an expense or a burden. He was meant to be getting a blessing, someone who would complement him, a helpmeet. That leads me to item number 7, which is when you combine the first 6, youth, beauty, attractiveness, your womb, still being young, never reproduced for anyone before, your traditional values, your femininity, not traumatized. When you add all of that, no debt, what you get is a partner for life, till death do both of you part. And what that meant was that you had someone who will be with you until the end. Let's say back in the day, the average life expectancy, if you go back to the 19th century and the early 20th century, life expectancy was about 50 plus years. So in principle, you were getting a life partner for 50 years. Now, because there was no traumatized experiences, because both of you, both the man and the woman, were taught and raised and prepared for the responsibility of marriage, both parties endured. They went through, difficulties and setbacks and challenges and pressures and stormy seasons, but they stayed because they needed each other. And that was possible because of the gender roles that were very well defined. I'm not saying one was easier than the other, but they complemented each other. That is the ideal scenario. Now, in the few minutes I have left, let me ask you to juxtapose everything that I've shared so far with the following. This is the reality in the West, in the developed West. In some countries, it's more pronounced. In some other countries, it's less pronounced. But let's start with the first, your sexual marketplace value. Number 1, your beauty, your youth. As of 2022, and this has been the same since 2019, the average age at which a woman in the UK gets married is 33 to 34. Actually, the age as of 2022 is 34. So if we go back to what I explained about the sexual marketplace value and how I myself cannot compete with my younger self, it means that the man is obtaining the woman, or the woman is presented to the man, almost at the end of the peak of a sexual value. At the end of a sexual value, I should say, not the peak, the bottom of a sexual value. Not a very, very easy thing for women to hear a man say. But I use myself as an example simply to illustrate that this is not an emotional conversation where I'm trying to win points. I'm simply stating the fact. I cannot compete against nature. If I do, there's only one person who will be hurt, and that's myself. So if most women are getting married at 34, which is probably at the end of their sexual peak, it means men are receiving much less. 25-year-old Mensa against me today, you can't compare. I'm referring to sexual marketplace. You just can't compare both. The second thing has to do then with the body and the womb of the woman, which has to do with her reproductive fertility value. There's a bit of a challenge that we have here, because if the average age for marriage for women today is 34, now we know that geriatric pregnancy begins at 35. Geriatric pregnancy is high risk pregnancy. From 35 and above, that's high risk. Any OBYGN, the obstetrician and gynecologist, would advise that you prepare early in advance and not leave it too late. What that means is, if you think about what I explained about the four groups, 18 to 22 first group, 23 to 27 second group, 28 to 32 third group, 33 to 36, 3 years. Now, if you just imagine that you lost 25% of your reproductive fertility value for every 5 years, that would mean in the first group, second group, third group, you've lost 75%. Sorry, you lose 26% each in each. You in principle lost roughly about, before you get to the last 3 years of your life, of that phase, 32 to 30, 33 to 36, you've lost probably roughly about 80% of your reproductive value. And that simply means the quality of your eggs are much less, the quantity are much less. So at 34, if you got married at 34, and recognizing that most people will wait a few months after they've been married to start reproducing. You know, you have your honeymoon, you need some time, and then you start trying to have a child. And in most cases, it goes into high risk pregnancy phase. So what that means is that if at 25, again, I don't believe women should be getting married at 25. I think you're far too young. But let's just use 25 as a number, because what we're looking at here is what used to happen in the past against what's happening today. Yeah, back in the 1940s and leading up to the 2000s, the average age of marriage was 25. In principle, that would mean that your reproductive fertility value was roughly about an 8 or a 9. If you've waited until 34 and you have a child at 35, your reproductive fertility value is between 1 and 2 at best, because it's just at the borderline of high risk pregnancy. So the reality of what men are getting today is you're not really getting value. The price you're paying for the benefit you believe that will accrue to you is not the same. Let me juxtapose this with a sad truth, which is, number one, most young women today do not want to have children. Again, I respect that decision. For those who do, they do not want to have more than one. In some cases, 1 out of 3 in the UK, we have women who already have had kids out of wedlock. So they have already given their womb, which is the highest honor a woman gives to a man, to say, I will reproduce life for you. You give me the seed, I'll reproduce life for you. That is the highest honor a woman gives a man. So when she's reproduced for another man who is not in the picture, in principle, the man who is marrying the woman is receiving less than the man who was there before him, his predecessor. So you have this conundrum, which is, she may not want to have children, she may just want to have one, or she may already have her kids. So the question is, what is the man getting? The cost, the price he's paying, what is he getting for all of that? Those are the first 3 issues. Your youth and beauty, which is less in reality. your body and your womb, which is already been used. The next has to do with the idea that modern men today and modern women today have not been raised over the last 50, 60 years. We haven't been raised in the traditional value system that we once were raised by. And what that means is that we're not prepared. Most of us go into the concept of a union in ignorance. We haven't been taught how to be wives, and we haven't been taught how to be husbands. For men particularly, most men have not been taught how to be men because there are no fathers in such families. And so most men don't know what it means to be a man, let alone what it means to be a father, let alone what it means to be a husband. So men are failing in every single area. But I'm talking to men, so let me deal with the issues with women. The traditional values that most women used to have are no longer there. Most can't cook, most cannot clean, most are not domesticated, most have not been taught how to serve. The consequence of this is that for most women, especially modern women, unfortunately, they see the traditional gender roles as similar to slavery. They see it as a chore, a punishment. They see it as though you're going backwards. They're going backwards. And there's something that is not quite understood, which is, if someone is taking or asking for your hand in marriage, then by default that person is an adult. The amount of care required for an adult is much less. So the requirement for being a wife is much less than the requirement for being a mother, because between the year 0 and about 7, most kids need close to 24-hour attention. They need a lot of attention because they cannot help themselves. They cannot look after themselves. Which brings a slight dilemma, which has to do with the fact that if the woman is complaining that she shouldn't cook for her husband, or it should be equal, or if she's complaining that she shouldn't serve her husband, or it should be equal, it means that she's ill-equipped when the real task comes, which is a child or a family. If the man wants a family, or if both want a family. And what that means is, in the area of what I call your non-sexual marketplace value, women are failing in modern society today. Not a value judgment, I'm simply saying that is the reality. Most are lazy, most are very dirty, most are not domesticated. As a matter of fact, let me put out a challenge, because this has been my experience. Over my entire lifetime, I haven't been, I guess you might say, that impressed. I've lived with women in the halls of residence. I've lived as flatmates. I've stayed with friends who lived with women. I've stayed with friends, been with their wives. I have friends who were women, and I have friends who are men. On the average, and on the aggregate, I find men to be much more domesticated from the perspective of being clean, knowing how to cook, knowing how to look after themselves, much more so than modern women today. Now, this could be an anecdotal experience, but why don't you test this out and look across your friends and your associates and make that comparison. I'll leave, if what I've said to you about being lazy and not clean strikes a nerve, then that means perhaps I might be speaking to you, because if someone were to say men are slobs, men are dirty, I wouldn't feel offended, for one reason: I'm not in that group. As a matter of fact, of all the people that I have spent my youth time growing up with, I have never met a woman who is cleaner than myself. Now, I have no OCDs, I'm not crazy about cleanliness. It just has to do with the fact that the standards have been dropped so much But in the same way, those standards have been intentional. As part of the liberation, most women have not taught their daughters of the importance of having those domestic skills, of being feminine, of knowing how to conduct yourself, of having those virtues and values that we once used to be proud of. In any case, let me move away from that. Now, when you take all the 4 items I've mentioned, just as I conclude, what comes to mind is that if you add that to the fact that today, most marriages only last for 7 years, not 50 years, which is what we used to have in mind before, till death do us part. If marriages are lasting for just 7 years, what that means is that not only is the man not getting any of what he believed he would get before, he's getting it in a very short period of time. 50 years, today we live, most people are living until about 75, 80 years. That's the life expectancy. But let's say you're married at 30 and you live till 75, that's 45 years. 45 years, but if the divorce rate on average is about 7 years, what that simply means is that if you divide 7 by 45, that in many ways tells you that that's only roughly about 14% of what you would have had before as a life partner. So men are receiving much less. The conclusion has to be that the price that men have to pay, when compared to the benefits that men will get from marriage in modern society today, one has to stop and ask a simple question. Who benefits? Who benefits? It seems more like a zero-sum game where one person gains and one person loses, as opposed to a positive sum game. I think men today should be very careful about that decision. Firstly, we haven't been raised by good fathers. We haven't been taught how to be men. We haven't been taught how to be husbands. And when you juxtapose that with the fact that what you're getting for the price you have to pay, the cost you have to pay, I am of the opinion that with the exception of those who really want to have a family, there is no benefit to men to get married. As a matter of fact, marriage is ideal for women, and divorce is also ideal for women. In either case, the man comes out not just a fraction less, a significant margin less. All of that is the reason why I've said so far that the decision about marriage is not one that should be